only right and proper that the story of Manchester should begin with water, and hills quite far from the city itself, for this is where it all began. On the eternal calendar of history, and on the record of the marks that man has made on the land on which he lives, Manchester could be considered little more than an afterthought. Not much more than 200 years ago, the province between these hills and the sea 20 miles to the west, largely the county of Lancashire today, was the poorest and most backward region in the land. If London is the head and brains of the body of England, these Derbyshire peaks the lungs, and the Pennines as a whole the spine, then the vast conurbation that was to arise at the end of this road was the heart. The great muscle that sucked in raw materials and men and pumped out manufactured goods for the world. There was no grand design. Rather, it was an accident when the forces of man and nature cooperated to be in the right place at the right time. No design, but it did have a name, as every schoolboy knows. It was called the Industrial Revolution. Nature played her part. She created the hills that guaranteed a plentiful supply of water on the plain below, and a soft, damp atmosphere suitable for the weaving of cloth. Beneath the ground, she provided seams of coal for men to hew to drive the engines of the revolution. And man was more than ready to play his part too. This was a hard and hostile land on which to earn a living. Agricultural workers, mostly in the employ of the great landowners, labored long hours for little reward. They were ready for a change, ready to leave the land for something new. The factories that grew up just beyond the horizon sent out smoke signals of invitation. Life in the mills and warehouses could be no harder than life on the land. And the skills of the non-agricultural workers were the right ones. Cottage industries devoted to weaving, the weaving of wool from the sheep on the hillsides, and of linen brought across the water from the flax fields of Ireland. combination of factors was right. The backward were about to make the great leap forward. Most of it happened in the span of a human lifetime, about 80 years from 1760 to 1840. Towns such as Wigan and Bolton and Bury and Rochdale virtually doubled their populations every decade and reached out to touch each other with fingers of brick. They are the spokes of the wheel of which Manchester is the hub. The raw material of the Industrial Revolution was cotton, brought across the Atlantic from the New World. The cargo ships docked at Liverpool, just to the west, and not at Wigan Pier, as the old music hall joke would have it. But the road to Wigan Pier was the route George Orwell took when he wanted to measure the effects of the Depression in the 1930s. Trade is a two-way street. Not only do the raw materials need to reach the mills and factories, but the finished goods needed to go back out into the world for sale and profit. It is hard to imagine from the motorways of today, but the roads of 200 years ago were inefficient and expensive. The Northwest has the dubious distinction of having the first motorway in the country. But the excitement of that was nothing compared to the first passenger railway service in the land, opened between Manchester and Liverpool in 1830. Motorways are little more than extensions of the roads that ran there before. The railway was brand new and put a locomotive at the front of the revolution and wheels underneath it. Running parallel to the development of the roads and railways, literally at times, was the network of canals that crisscrossed Lancashire in all directions. They were the veins carrying the blood to the heart. The greatest and most important of them all was the last to be built. The Manchester Ship Canal was opened 100 years ago and turned an inland city 35 miles from the coast into the third busiest port in the United Kingdom. It wasn't built without a fight. The burghers of Liverpool opposed it for 60 years because they feared the loss of tariffs. But the merchants of Manchester finally won the day, and Irish navvies, some no older than schoolboys, did the digging. The earlier canals had been smaller, for barges to carry coal and finished goods. Cheap travel, but painfully slow. If they were the veins, the ship canal was an artery, bringing foreign ports directly to Manchester and vice versa. There was one other ingredient necessary to bring about the revolution. The magic ingredient, human invention. In a short space of time had come Kay's flying shuttle, Hargreaves' flying jenny, Arkwright's spinning frame, and Crompton's mule. Together, they meant the end of cottage industry and the birth of industry as we know it today. The one industry, the cotton weaving industry, spawned others. Chemicals were needed for the production of cloth, and heavy engineering was needed to make and drive the new machines. Success followed success, and the Lancashire air reeked with the smell of it. The first day the canal opened, January the 1st, 1894, 71 ships sailed along it to Salford Quays, Manchester's port. The aged Queen Victoria waited until better weather in May before she too made the journey. The Liverpudlians were crushed and no longer sang their taunting song, "O ye lords of the loom, pray avert your sad doom, we humbly beseech on our knees. We do not complain that you drink your champagne, but leave us our port, if you please." Today, Salford Quays has undergone a second metamorphosis. Like the ports of London and Liverpool, it has been rejuvenated in the last decade with new offices and residential housing. The water has been oxygenated, a marina built, and it is being developed as a tourist attraction. There had been talk of closing it altogether, filling in the docks and treating the area as a building site. That would have been an offence to the people who built it 100 years ago. But they would probably find just as strange the concept of a leisure centre. Leisure was not a word heard frequently in the heyday of the Industrial Revolution. The ship canal and the development of Salford was a climacteric in the life of Manchester as an industrial city. By then, the rest of the developed world was catching up. Manchester had been the engine room of the British Empire, and the empire itself would never be quite as great again. By then, much had been achieved. The city had been built and was there to stay. It allowed one historian to say, Manchester is the only English city which can look London in the face, not merely as a regional capital, but as a rival version of how men should live in a community. In 1725, Daniel Defoe called Manchester the greatest mere village in England. By 1840, it was the most modern city in the world. The town that had had neither local government nor parliamentary representation won both, and trumpeted the fact to the outside world by building a superbly Gothic town hall, with a spire almost 300 feet tall that nobody could miss. Where working men and women gather together in numbers, there are the ingredients for social change. Trade unionism, Chartism and socialism all flourished in Manchester's streets and factories. So too did the women's suffrage movement. Emmeline Pankhurst was born in Manchester, and her daughter, Christabel, served a sentence in Strangeways prison for spitting at a policeman trying to arrest her. That sentence, in 1905, was to mark the beginning of the militant phase of the suffragettes' campaign. Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, used to campaign outside Central Station. Today, that station is the Greater Manchester Exhibition and Events Centre. Another demonstration, perhaps, of how modern Manchester not so much disguises its past, but recycles it for today's use. Probably the best-known street of modern Manchester is not a street at all, but a backlot of Granada television. Coronation Street, a faithful recreation of a Manchester terrace, similar to thousands round about, but reserved for the cameras and the sightseers. For more than 30 years, the Coronation Street of fiction has mirrored the changes in all the Coronation Streets of fact. A social history of sorts in a medium denied to the historians of the past. Had Granada television existed in 1819, it would have had quite a story to cover. On a Sunday afternoon, there was to be a rally to hear a radical MP, Henry Hunt, call for the reform of Parliament. The population of Manchester, denied their own MPs, turned out in force to hear Hunt. Up to 60,000 people from Manchester and surrounding towns were at St. Peter's Fields, which has since been built over. Magistrates were panicked by the number, and troops waded in. In the space of 10 minutes, 11 unarmed people were killed and 600 injured. As many of the troops and demonstrators had been at Waterloo, it became known as the Peterloo Massacre. The resultant outrage led directly to the Great Reform Bill of 1832, under which Manchester did finally get the representation it warranted. The trouble with being the most modern city in the world in the mid-19th century was that it had to contend first with the social problems that went hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution. Slums, desperate overcrowding, and urban poverty. Manchester had to be a welfare city long before there was a welfare state. The city skyline then was dominated not by banks, shopping centres and office blocks, but by factories and warehouses. The workers lived in tenements in the shadows of their workplaces, and Manchester was not a healthy place in which to live. Elizabeth Gaskell came to live in Manchester in 1832. Her novels, Mary Barton and North and South, gave graphic descriptions of the working class life in the city. Friedrich Engels lived here with an Irish woman who helped him to understand life in the streets, and which led in 1844 to his tract, The Condition of the Working Class in England. But fortunes were made, especially by those who had the foresight and capital to get in first, and those who had the wisdom and ingenuity to cash in on what already existed. A stock exchange was opened, and banks and insurance companies flocked to the city. Foreign entrepreneurs and buyers came too, and learned their lessons well, so that they could take them home and do the same thing there. There cannot be another city in the land like Manchester, where so much has happened in such a relatively short time and whose lifespan has covered so few generations. The problem for the city fathers this century has been how to reshape the new Manchester around the still strongly beating heart of the last century. Manchester has already gained itself an international reputation as a seat of learning and scholarship. Apart from its famous grammar school, it has 4 universities. At the Victoria University of Manchester, Ernest Rutherford held the chair of physics, and it was where in 1919 he was the first to split the atom. He it was who said, "There is only physics. Everything else is stamp collecting." Rutherford was following in the city's scientific tradition, a byproduct that grew out of the needs of industry. A century before, John Dalton was famous as a meteorologist and for his atomic theory, and a pupil of Dalton was James Prescott Joule, who gave his surname to a unit of energy. Manchester also developed the world's first commercially available computer. When asked to contribute government money, the then president of the Board of Trade replied, "It is the government's considered opinion that there will never be a need in Britain for more than 2 computers." And it was in Manchester in 1904 that the entrepreneur and salesman Charles Rolls met the car manufacturer Henry Royce, giving birth to a partnership and to a product of elegance and distinction even today. If the name of Manchester is known abroad today, it is as likely to be for its football clubs as its past. Manchester United is one of the most famous clubs in the world, an affection that was heightened by the tragedy of the Munich air crash in 1958, when 8 members of the team and 15 other people were killed. If United is the team supported by those who don't live in the city, then Manchester City is said to be the team followed by Mancunians themselves. An oversimplification maybe, but certainly there is partisanship. One famous Lord Mayor publicly praised the 2 great teams in the city, Manchester City and Manchester City Reserves. And Old Trafford Cricket Ground, the home of Lancashire Cricket Club, is a regular test match venue. On this pitch, Cyril Washbrook played his last innings, and Clive Lloyd played his first. Partly in the hope of securing the Olympic Games for Manchester, the city has created a national cycling centre, complete with an oyster-shaped indoor velodrome. The popularity of cycling was given a boost when a young man from the northwest, Chris Boardman, emphatically won an Olympic gold medal. Despite failing so far in its bid to have the Olympic Games held in Manchester, the city is going ahead with the building of an arena alongside Victoria Station. It will hold 16,500 spectators for everything from equestrian events to pop concerts. But if one sport absorbs the minds and strains the muscles of local people, it is rugby league. It is a game they have made virtually their own. If modern cities measure their importance by the size of their airports, then Manchester is in the Premier Division. More than 12 million passengers currently use the airport, and the figure is expected to double by the end of the century. To cope with the extra demands, a new terminal was opened in 1993. In the sports-mad northwest, its size was measured in football pitches, above 200 in all. For decades, residential Manchester had expanded like a starfish along its main roads. But the development of Wythenshawe Garden City between the wars was a planned venture. City fathers were appalled by surveys that showed so many of the inner city houses still to be without indoor toilets and to be riddled with damp and with vermin. Wythenshawe was to be the shape of things to come. Wythenshawe, with planned industrial zones and civic amenities, was built for 100,000 people. But rents ranging from the equivalent of 45 to 78 pence a week were out of range of most slum dwellers who were lucky to earn £2 a week. It was not until the 1960s that Wythenshawe reached full capacity. The Garden City was built around Wythenshawe Park and its hall, a gift to the city by the family who owned it and who helped in the development of the satellite town. There was a tradition of paternalism adopted by some employers from the squirearchy who existed before the Industrial Revolution. The community of style south of Wythenshawe was created by and was a fiefdom of the Gregg family. They assumed a role in the education, recreation and social welfare of their employees. It may have been easier to do in a rural setting, but the workers in the 1830s were encouraged to exercise in specially provided gardens, to use a playground for games, to attend tea parties and music lessons in the winter months. In other words, when they were away from the mill, the workers and their families should be encouraged to lead rational and sober lives. But, as is frequently the case, paternalism was mixed with patronization. Samuel Gregg Jr. said his mill workers were, quote, quite capable of being made very worthy, sensible, respectable, and happy. By gently leading them, you may succeed in making them what you wish them to be. What the Greggs and others were trying to stem was what they called the separation of the classes. Working men, congregating together in numbers for the first time in mills and factories, were removed from what they believed was the civilizing influence of the wealthy squires and landowners. They were right to be concerned, of course. The one political certainty brought about by the Industrial Revolution was that it put pay to the rich man in his castle and the poor man at his gate. Farther south still is the most visible and recognizable landmark in Cheshire. It is the Jodrell Bank Science Centre, an extension of Manchester University. The dish is the size of the dome of St. Paul's, but upended to listen to the stars. It was built in 1957. A fortunate coincidence that meant it was just in time to monitor man's puny rivals to the stars beyond the Earth's atmosphere. Manchester and Birmingham Railway, opened in 1842, deliberately went as far south as Alderley to exploit the day excursion market from Manchester. Alderley, with its heavily wooded edge, was a beauty spot, and the experiment was a success. The resident gentry, the Stanleys of Park House, found the tourists a nuisance. Lady Stanley complained that the Hottentot grandees were worse than their workers, as one can neither handcuff nor great dog them if they are intrusive. But the Stanleys were to lose. A day trip can easily become a daily trip. By the turn of the century, Alderley Edge had become a dormitory town of Manchester, part of a commuter belt for the wealthy. The women immersed themselves in middle-class respectability, playing golf or tennis, paying calls on each other, playing cards and sewing for charity. An account of Alderley Edge life, written by a genteel lady of the town in 1900, says it would have been unthinkable, even indelicate, for the women to travel with men to Manchester. But the men did it in style. In the days before trains had corridors, one carriage would be reserved for the wealthy and select few. Exclusive club cars with luxurious seats and light refreshments. The women would wait for evenings and weekends to bask in the sunshine of masculine society. Away from the city and its commuter towns, the people of Manchester do not have to travel far in any direction for the full variety of English scenery. To the west is the sea. To the east, the Derbyshire Peak District. To the south are the plains of Cheshire, and to the north, the magnificent and romantic Lake District. Lyme Park stands at the gateway to the Derbyshire Peak District, and at 1,200 feet above sea level, its great house is higher than any other stately home in the land. The deer in the park are descendants of those hunted in Elizabethan times. The house was owned by one family for 600 years, until just after the Second World War. In the grounds is the Lyme Cage, a medieval lookout post used for deer hunting. A man called Joseph Watson, who was still a huntsman at the age of 102, once drove 24 stags from Lyme to Windsor just to win a bet. Just beyond Lyme Hall, nature, not man, is the master again. The Derbyshire peaks stand with their backs to Manchester and the changes that happened within their sight. But even the peaks have not totally escaped the intrusions of man and the demands of industry. The water that they have in abundance is an essential stepping stone to industrial and urban progress. In the past, these were moors that had to be crossed in winter with dread by travellers and sheep drovers. Communities such as Chapel-en-le-Frith and Chapel Milton were little more than wayside stops where weary travellers could rest aching feet. But then the forked tongue of the great railway serpent tasted the Derbyshire air and found it to be good. The railways and the roads that followed made the land accessible in ways it had never been before. The peaks of Derbyshire were always in sight of the workers of Manchester, weather permitting, of course. Its villages were just a day trip away with the new communications, but they couldn't legally set foot on the moors. The wealthy landowners of the Peak District remained much as they had always done, reserving the land for themselves and the odd day or two of grouse shooting each year. The wheel of the Industrial Revolution was about to turn full circle. One Sunday in 1932, more than 500 militant left-wing workers from Manchester and Sheffield, whose antecedents had left the countryside only a few generations before, walked to the top of Kinder Scout, the remotest of the moors. It was a deliberate mass trespass, which left 6 of them in jail. But a movement had started that was irresistible. The trespass led eventually to the creation of the Countryside Commission, the establishment of national parks, the Peak District being the first, and the creation of public walks such as the Pennine Way. The great-great-grandchildren of the men who had fled the land for the slums of Manchester were back, and free to walk on it as if it was their own. So the history of Manchester is still bound up with the land and the water that surrounds it, just as it was 200 years ago when it started. But Manchester's story has not finished. It has hardly begun. The wheels of the revolution are still spinning.